that. So hopefully I can provide some use. So I'm talking today about building the right team, and that doesn't just mean hiring people. I'm also looking at things around investors, co-founders, and kind of the nuts and bolts of managing people. So what we're going to do is first go through the nuts and bolts of actually building and hiring your team, and that is everything from the kind of literal process to kind of what to think about when you do deal with that. The second part is kind of how you think about surrounding yourself with the right people in a wider sense. So yes, team, but as I mentioned, also investors and co-founders. And then the last thing is about how to kind of leverage those people into creating the kind of right team culture and kind of a positive environment that allows you to kind of get the best out of people. Let me just move you out the way so that I can see everything. So, and what I'll do is at the end of each of these three things, we can do a bit of, if there are any questions, you can give me a shout. So let's jump straight into nuts and bolts of building a team. And again, this is going to be kind of very functional initially. So basically, how do you understand what it is that you're looking for? And one of the most difficult things is to work out what you're missing in your company. So clearly identifying what you already have in your company in terms of your team roles. And actually, one of you just mentioned that you've done a bit of a reshuffle. Understanding where the roles and responsibilities sit allow you to then understand what is missing from your team. And from there, you can then build up an idea of what roles you're looking for. And I see on many occasions, people think they need one thing and they actually need another thing. And that is something where talking to other people about what you feel is missing within your team or within your kind of company processes is a great way to really understand that. And that can be, people or a colleague or a friend. But also there are, for example, people who've worked in recruitment out there who understand how teams grow and can provide that resource without actually any sort of commitment to utilizing their services. Then, of course, once you've done that, you've got to build out your sort of job description of your required skills. And a lot of people tend to fill these things with kind of wishy-washy, good time management and, self-motivated. And actually, sometimes you really need to look at the actual details. So what are the core competencies that you're looking for around technology? What are you looking for in terms of core experience? So have they, for example, dealt with customers? Have they been client facing? Are they competent with, particular pieces of software that are key to your business? And those things will reduce the amount of time that you have to spend onboarding people, training people, and getting them to fit into your company. So, and the other thing about that is thinking about what sort of candidates you might find when you're looking to hire someone. So I'll give you a very specific example. We were hiring for a P-backed startup with two-person team, and they wanted to hire an associate. This is in sort of litigation finance, so quite technical, quite legal, quite financial. And they said, well, we're going to target the big four. And I said, that's a terrible idea. You've got a team of two and the big four is cogs in machines. And I said, what you need to do is advertise an associate, but also advertise for an EA. And I said, you will get, no offense to the men and women in the room, you will get underqualified men applying for the associate role and overqualified women applying for the EA role, but you can have very similar requirements. And then you'll get a real idea of what expertise is out there and what's going to fit. And so those are the sorts of kind of bits of understanding that that actually finding someone who understands building and hiring the right teams is always useful for. And as I say, most recruiters, for example, will give you a bit of time to offer a bit of advice without any sort of commitment. One of the clear things about job descriptions that often people make mistakes on is advertiser salary. There's a 35% bump in application rates if you're using a salary bracket. And that has a massive impact on the number of candidates you've got, but also it sets a standard for you to actually deliver an understanding of what your financial contributions and what your financial budgets look like for the particular requirement you're looking for. And that's an important thing for you to do as someone running a business. And then the last step is understanding how people will fit into teams. So again, as a startup or an early business, you're going to have people who straddle a range of responsibilities. And it's important to understand how those people are going to be cohesive. And one of the things you can do actually to support that is do things like sort of behavioral tests, strengths tests, etc. And again, I'll give you a very specific example. I work with two incredibly experienced people who are both 15, 20 years older than me. And when one of them had joined the team and worked with me for 6 months, I brought the other one in. And there was a bit of a friction in the way that they worked together. And then we did a strengths test and realized that actually we were coming at everything. I was coming at everything with one of them from exactly the same position and with the other from a completely opposite position. So we reframed the way that we communicated as a trio, and suddenly everything worked again. So we understood that those strengths didn't necessarily sit in an aligned way, but actually that was an incredibly valuable thing. But if we hadn't sat down and done that exercise, I don't think we would have been able to create that kind of cohesion. So that's incredibly important to kind of understand how people complement each other. Then there's the kind of nuts and bolts of actually how to recruit. So in this day and age, recruitment has evolved as a process from an internal perspective. So yes, you can go to recruitment agents, and I'll be frank, the good ones are worth it. The bad ones, we all know, are a pain in the ass. But there are a whole range of different ways that you can now recruit. So for example, you can go to industry events, social media is becoming a really big thing. So TikTok, creating a really strong employer brand on TikTok actually can create very organic attraction from talent. And of course, the other thing you can do is actually look within the kind of networks that you already have by hosting events, podcasts, etc., or webinars. And that allows you to actually engage people in your company and your product and what you're trying to build before you even consider the idea of hiring them. And I mean, again, another example, my BD now is actually one of my users. And I was so astounded by the efficacy with which he used our business development component of our software that actually I was just like, you need to work for me. He was the first person I'd ever met who could drop in 15 to 20 client meetings a month, and he did it off his own back through our software. And I just said, you've got to come on our side. So that is something that that there is a whole range of places where you can find talent, and actually just chucking an advert on LinkedIn costs a lot of money. And if you don't have the resources to tap into the volume that you'll receive through that and to really effectively evaluate it, it's a very expensive way to do it. And then again, culture fit, really important, especially if you're in a small team. It can be really damaging if you have a small structure and you've got then someone who doesn't align in terms of the way you operate. And that's even more important in this day and age where people are sitting, sometimes remotely, and you're actually trying to create culture without having the benefits of the Friday night pub sesh of pre-COVID. And so understanding that and how people need touch points and how they can build culture outside of that kind of in-person engagement is something that it's important to think about. And even if that's a 15-minute morning, early morning check-in, or once a week, or twice a week, or whatever it is, understanding what your talent needs to actually feel engaged, certainly at a young age as well. I would think really carefully about people coming into the world of the work in their early 20s who perhaps haven't had that experience of the pre-COVID era of creating culture, basically. And then interviews, have a standard interview process. You can do effectively what you want, but try and be methodical and repetitive in the way that you interview different candidates. That will create a much more quantifiable balance and metric for evaluating candidates, and it'll allow you to kind of remove the very emotional and reactive component of it. And that means you're going to hire people who are better for your company because you're actually looking at the kind of core requirements that you're looking for. One interview question that I recommend, which I always use, especially in the world of startups, is I always ask people, if you could snap your fingers and be doing the dream job, what would it be? And if someone says to me, senior business development manager or something, I want to jump out of a high window, I want to hear people say, I'd run an F1 team, or as mine would be, I'd be a professional poker player. because that shows that there's more than just the checkbox criteria of I'm going to do this job. And realistically, in a small company, you're going to need people who are going to have forward thinking mindsets, who are going to be productive and driven, and can see that there is scope beyond the grind of the day to day that is doing a startup. And then the last thing is try and ask as open-ended questions as possible. It's like that old thing of, you know, when detectives interview criminals and they're using leading questions. Try not to use leading questions, because naturally people are very effective at following those little little pulls that you give people. So make it as open-ended as possible in order to be able to effectively assess candidates. And then there is the point of onboarding. Now, a lot of startups, and I will put myself in this category as well, don't have very structured onboarding processes. Now, I know in this room, certainly there are some very experienced people who've probably worked in larger companies who've seen how that structured onboarding process works. But trying to build something, it doesn't have to be very long. Don't make it overcomplicated, but have a clear process for everyone coming into the business, so that you're kind of benchmarking of what's required within the company and how you operate within the company is standardized across everyone, regardless of where they're coming into the company. And that will make your life your life easier as you kind of bring people into the business further down the line, because you'll have a very clear process. From a training perspective and creating early productivity, again, if you've got the definition of your roles right, people should be able to drop in much more efficiently into the tools and the systems that you're using, and therefore be able to hit the ground running. If they're completely new to the way that you operate, that's absolutely fine as well. But again, in the world of remote work, make sure you have those regular touch points so you can feel really engaged with the person who's come into your company, and that they're not feeling that they're sitting by themselves in their living room trying to engage with a new business that perhaps doesn't have those traditional structures. And the kind of component of mentorship, again, it's difficult in a small company, but it's very important to think about the things that sit around the actual core process of someone's job. Because at the end of the day, if they're coming in when you're 5 or 10 people, if they work out, they're going to be with you hopefully when you've got 50 or 100 people, which means there is going to be a natural progression in the way that they work. And that is something that, again, without some sort of guidance as to the evolution of their role, it's going to be a difficult thing to navigate. So having that kind of mentorship and ongoing support, whether from you or from one of your, co-founders or leadership team, etc., is a very useful way of kind of showing them where they can go in the future, which will make them actually by proxy more engaged at the moment, because they're not looking at kind of what they're doing now on the ground. And I took a real cheat sheet moment in building my team, because, as I say, 2 of my team members are 15, 20 years older than me, and at one point in their lives suffered from managing me. So I'm very confident in their ability to create that environment for our employees, just simply because they did it for me when I was 24. So thinking about that is very important. Any questions? And apologies if I'm moving very fast. Take that as a no. Okay, in which case I shall crack straight on. Right, surrounding yourself with the right people. So as we've talked about, building an early stage business isn't just about people you hire. And in fact, a lot of people won't get to hiring people for a little bit, because they'll be working with people who are much more on a kind of collaborative co-founder basis. So finding the right co-founders is incredibly important. And I suspect there are people in here who have either been involved in or been witness to the breakdown of co-founder relationships. So yes, there is a really important thing about shared vision. You have to believe in what you're building collectively, and that has to matter to both of you in the same sort of way. But the other thing is the whole idea of complementary skills. So understanding that actually you don't want 2 people who do exactly the same thing. That's not super helpful. But what you do want is 2 people who understand the importance of what the other person is doing, or 3 people, or 4 people. So thinking about that before you start building those big co-founder relationships is very important. And rather like living with someone, you've got to be in a position where you trust each other and you're able to have this kind of constant open communication. If you have to tiptoe around the person you're working with, you're going to waste a huge amount of time on small bugs and problems without being able to resolve them effectively. And that's something that can kill businesses in a really quite significant way. So that kind of frankness and straightforwardness is something that's really important. And as I say, that doesn't just apply to co-founders, it applies to team as well. And as an example, one of my team members, we sort of accidentally, by building our product, made her slightly obsolete. And we had a very, very frank conversation about it. And actually, ironically, in doing so, found another chunk of the business that she could step into and take ownership over and create a huge amount of value. But there was a real point where she was like, I think I need to leave. And that was terrifying as my first employee 2.5 years in. But actually, because we talked about what her skills were and what her interests were and her vision and her passion for the business, we were able to actually find value in her expertise and move it somewhere else in the business. And I've written here, long-term relationship, it's a marriage. It is. You're going to spend more time with this person probably than with your own, partner, just simply because you have to, the hours that you work on a business are absolutely insane. So do think about that in terms of not just the way you operate, but also the way you build those relationships, because it is a very challenging environment, and, you'll run into roadblocks left, right, and center, and you need to be very confident the person you're doing it with is going to be as driven to get past those roadblocks as you are. Finding the right teams, again, people early on, people need to believe in what you're doing when you hire them. They need to have a real kind of vision that aligns with what you're trying to grow. They might not need to do it until you're, alongside you until, when you're a 150 person, 500 person company. But in those early days, it's really important that the people you're hiring actually do deeply believe in what you're doing. I think there's a great feeling if you can find someone who can check the boxes and deliver, that it'll be okay. But actually, that's in itself quite a risky thing when you're a small team. And the other thing to think about is that if you hire people that do align to your kind of values and mission, that will perpetuate through the company as you grow, because they will feed into the next people you hire, because you're not going to have a touch point with every single person that comes into the company. So thinking about how those people are going to translate what you believe into, towards the next person that they hire or the people they manage is going to be something that becomes more and more impactful as you grow. And again, it's a very boring, repetitive thing, but it all comes down to trust and mutual alignment of vision. It's super important. And I've put in here spotting red flags and making tough decisions. And I've made this mistake. I kept someone in the company for 6.5 months, and I should have let them go a month in, and I didn't. And I always say the first person to tell you that there's a problem is you, and it's somewhere in the bottom of your stomach. If you feel you don't think someone's going to fit, or there isn't an alignment, or you're not getting the delivery, you've got to bite the bullets as fast as possible. It's the old adage of hire slow, fire fast. And if you get a feeling that something's not working, and as I said, I put my hands up, I made this mistake and it's been an absolute pain in the ass, you've got to bite the bullet, because you don't have the luxury of time and 100 people where you're actually talking about 1% of the value in your business. If there are 5 of you, you're talking about 20% of the impact of your business. So you really do need to be brutal with these things, because just like if you had a bad feeling about a nanny looking after your baby, you'd make a decision quickly. This is your baby, and someone looking after a portion of it is massively, massively impactful. And then the last one is investors. I know that there are multiple people in here, myself included, who spend much of my life hunting investors. I have a very sort of fixed thing on this, which is I like clever, loud money and quiet, dumb money. Be very careful of dumb, loud money, because again, rather like your team, if things aren't aligned and things don't fit, you're going to spend an absolute chunk of your time managing those relationships, and it's incredibly inefficient. And you do have to align values, you do have to align vision, and sometimes it takes time to build what your vision is going to look like. So having people you can have an open conversation with about that is really, really important. And I literally last night was having a conversation about whether I want to build a VC backed super massive, £500 million company, or whether I want to do an angel backed steady growth, 50 to 100 million pound company, and take my time, and being able to have frank conversations with the right investors is really important. And I would also add, don't undermine any part of who you are or what you're trying to build just because someone's writing you a check. My very personal experience of that was when someone asked me if I had a husband. and whether I wanted kids. And I, because of some cultural misalignments, didn't feel comfortable saying, I do want kids, and my 24-year-old dancer girlfriend is probably going to have them. And I actually really had to set the boundary of like, I don't care if he's going to write me a check for £250,000. There isn't going to be a value alignment here, and it's going to make me very uncomfortable. So thinking about that is super important. And then the last thing is make sure to vet your investors. There are a huge number of egos out there, and there are a huge number of, we know there are plenty of people with lots of money who are really lovely human beings. One of them is running for president in the United States at the moment. So do make sure to vet your investors. Do make sure to talk to portfolio companies. And that doesn't matter whether you're talking about, you know, execs in funds that you're working with or individuals, but actually do get that kind of feedback and those references, because rather like your co-founder relationship, they're getting into your bed for 5, 6, 7, maybe 10 years. You need to know that you're going to be really comfortable with the people that you're going to be working with. Any questions around this area? Nope. Okay.
I can't find the button.
Can't find a button.
To raise my hand.
Go for it.
I do have a question. Full-time co-founders versus fractional co-founders. Where people are fractional, by definition, they're not going to give as much of themselves as they would if they're full-time. How do you manage that and work out earlier when it's not going to work out, when the stronger signals you'd get from a full-time co-founder are by nature weak signals?
So I think you want to look at that from a qualitative basis, not a quantitative basis. So it's very easy to think about hours worked and time. And I've had one full-time co-founder and 2 fractional, I say co-founder, one of them's not quite a co-founder, but he basically is. And one of my CTO currently, he's part-time. Now, he's incredible. And the reason he's incredible is because I can see the way he accommodates other parts of the business, the way he'll jump in when I really need, the way he'll support outside of, you know, the actual nuts and bolts of what his job is, you know, the way he'll be a sounding board to me when I'm stressed about things. That's actually the stuff that creates value, because at the end of the day, if all we're doing is looking at how many hours do you work, really you're not creating a relationship. So I mean, you know, yes, there's an advantage of having 2 people whose souls are 100% full-time in it, but I don't think that has to undermine the quality of a relationship if someone is working 3 days a week or 4 days a week. If the other thing I would do, and again, this comes back to the open communication thing, is if you see a trajectory where you would expect your co-founder to transition at some point from fractional to full-time when the company required it, you need to be having those conversations. Not for commitment, not for you absolutely have to, but if they're sitting there going, oh, I'm never going to do that, then that's going to undermine the long-term trajectory of the business, if that's something you want. However, if you're okay with the idea that he or she will always be fractional, then fine. But that comes back to the communication thing. But I think try not to think about it as well, they work 25 hours a week and I work 145, you know? Does that remotely answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
Any other questions? Just conscious of time, so I'm going to crack on to the last slide. I've tried to keep this as brief and as efficient as possible. So actually this very much comes back to what we just said, which is creating a positive team culture. So trust is everything, and that can be in the best of times and the worst of times. Really being able to connect with the people you work with, talk about things, have frank conversations about feedback. It's super, super important. And the irony is when something's not working, you'll find yourself being averse to having a conversation. And that, in my mind, is one of the biggest red flags, because actually it shows you that you don't have a positive culture with someone. But that kind of benchmarking of having those conversations, I would push for it as much as possible. And the other thing is, what it will do is, if you can show your team, especially as a small team, that sometimes things go wrong and sometimes things are difficult and they're okay with it, you know you've got a really strong team, because actually they are there when the things are bad. They're not just sitting there waiting for the things to be good. And again, I've worked with co-founders and team members who I describe it as wanted to ride my coattails and did not really turn up and do the work. And now I work with a team who, oh my God, they are just incredible and so patient and so hardworking and so open to me being like, oh my God, it's falling apart. And they don't panic and they don't freak out. And we just have a conversation. And that's really, really nice. So have a think about what strategies you can build. And also do make sure, going back to my conversation about our different strengths between me and my two of my colleagues, do make sure you understand who requires what sort of method of narrative. You don't want to create an environment where someone who might be perhaps not an extrovert or very focused on the emotional components of problem solving or needs time to think about things before they contribute. Do create those environments where those people can comfortably sit in the space and don't feel bulldozed by other people's kind of immediate logic driven kind of very strategic and matter of fact approaches. And as I say, that's something I've really had to learn to get used to. Innovation, creativity, teamwork, all very challenging in the post-COVID world, but super important in terms of the way that you kind of build those, the way you work. So you do have to talk to people about what they need in terms of creating that kind of creativity. We no longer, in a lot of cases, have the buying a coffee, a water cooler kind of creative moment. So creating space for that is super, super important. And again, being really vocal about how people have contributed to successes, evolutions in the business, etc. That's super important in terms of making people feel really engaged. And then last thing is keeping people motivated and resilient during challenges. You don't always have to be the absolute rock solid founder who's like, I've got everything. Sometimes you can just be like, I'm really struggling, but that's okay. So talking to people about the things that you're facing as that are challenging, but also creating space for both you and your team to have kind of a good work-life balance and a bit of freedom in terms of the way you're working. Last thing I will give you is the metaphor that some of you will have heard about being a startup founder. And that is that those old canal boats that used to be pulled along by a horse, and your team is the people who bail out the water and drive the canal boat and cook and clean. And you're the horse. And so it's incredibly difficult and incredibly challenging because you have to keep things moving forward. But remember that all of those other components keep that boat moving smoothly and make your life easier. So having those kind of good, engaging conversations with your team will be really, really important. And that is it. Now I will stop talking too much.
Thank you very much, Louisa. I've got a question, but I'm going to put it out to the floor first. Anyone got a question for Louisa this morning? Or any additional questions?
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say I think your question about if you can snap your fingers, have your dream job, and what their answer is, I think that's brilliant.
Well, it's good for startups for sure. Because I have the number of people who said to me, I'd like to be a senior project manager. And I'm like, nope.
Laura.
Thank you. Thanks, Louisa. That was brilliant. So my question was just around sort of responsibilities as an employer and thinking about when I've hired before and the frameworks that I've used, like within a corporate setting, how much of those really have been like a legal requirement and how much of those have just been an attempt at sort of formalizing what the culture is. So I'm thinking about that framework of initial questions. I've always had it before that you always had to ask the same question to every candidate and mark them kind of comparatively. And I suppose sort of following on from that, where would we as small business owners keep up to date easily, simply with the requirements that we have from a legal perspective about how we recruit, how we develop, and how we deal with low performance or issues between teams? Is there a resource that you sort of think, yes, this is it? And I'm particularly thinking about all of the changes that are coming in with the new government. So one of the things that I've seen in the press is the kind of, almost like the abolition of the probationary period of like you've got sort of full rights as an employee from day one. And your advice to fire fast, how we would be able to enact that.
Yeah, so so in terms of sourcing information, I'd find yourself a pet employment lawyer, and I would find yourself a specific firm that does primarily employment law, because everyone says they do it, but you want to find yourself someone specific. And not necessarily to use them as a lawyer, but as an example, I use a firm called Bayani, and I'll get the spelling of it afterwards and I'll send it to you. But they do really good update newsletters on evolutions of legislation around hiring. So it's a really useful way to understand those kind of nuts and bolts of what you legally have to do. In terms of the actual core function of the process, it's an interesting one around the legality, because yes, there is a reason that corporates have fixed processes, and it's less because they are forced to, and more because the more ambiguity you bring into either a recruitment process or an onboarding process or an offboarding process, the more risk you put yourself at. And again, I'll put my hands up, as a startup founder, I've had this problem where I'm running a startup and I think, well, it's fine, I've got all my nuts and bolts and I've got my policies and all that kind of stuff, but everything's going to be quite straightforward and we're having a good relationship. And then suddenly everything goes sideways because someone's nitpicking at what you're doing. And you're like, well, I should have made it more corporate. And it's a horrible feeling in a startup. In terms of hiring, diversity is a really big thing. So making sure you are asking very meritocratic questions, and you aren't taking into account things like race, background, religion, etc. Really, really important, because you don't ever want anyone to turn around and go, that wasn't fair. Be careful with things like AI as well, because we know that's a problem. There have been cases already about that. In terms of your actual onboarding processes, make sure that, again, you try and keep them as simple as possible. There isn't that clear legislation about what your onboarding has to be, but certain things about disclosing policies really clearly, showing people what your employment handbook looks like, making sure your contract covers all of the nuts and bolts. And to be clear, again, this is something I'm dealing with right now. For example, whose legal responsibility is it to return possessions after you leave? What is the holiday policy and what processes do they have to go through? If they're asking for flexible work, what processes do they have to go through? All the way up to the kind of government requirements. Now, if you look at something like Seed Legals, a lot of their policy handbooks, their employee handbooks, will cover a lot of those policies in terms of what those exit processes are and those onboarding processes are. So what I would also do is get yourself one of those templates, and I can probably spit out what we currently operate on, and it will give you all the benchmarks of, here, I've got a written warning and I've got another written warning and we had a review meeting and and that will give you the process. And the last thing, if you can do it, is I would record / AI note take, whatever, every meeting if you're having an issue with an employee. Because if you get to a point where you have to have an in-depth discussion about it, it's so much easier than he said, she said. And again, without disclosing too much information, this is a battle I'm fighting at the moment, where we had a great relationship and everything went to shit, and now it's a real problem. So, but as I say, get yourself onto a legal newsletter, and they will give you constant updates on new legislation. I'll send you the link to the one that I'm on as a really good resource, just to flag where things have changed and you might have different responsibilities.
I think
Super, thank you.
Louisa, Laura makes a good point, because that particular piece of legislation that Labour are looking at, rights from first day, make it even more important to listen to you and to make the right decision before hire. Obviously, before we had a 2-year grace period, obviously that's looking to change very, very quickly. So founders need to make sure that they hire right.
But also be aware, and a lot of people don't know this, that the 2-year grace period never gave you free rein to behave how you wanted. You still had to comply with the processes of exiting someone from the business. The only difference was they didn't have the weaponry to go after you for things like unfair dismissal or constructive dismissal. So actually, if you're behaving in a way, or you have behaved in a way previously that is compliant with what should be the normal offboarding processes, nothing in your life is going to change, because you'll check all those boxes anyway. But I am fully aware that a lot of companies have thought, if you're under 2 years, you can't take a swing me, so I don't care. So all of those kind of behavioral practices are going to stay the same. It's just that if you don't do it right, they can now take a swing at you under 2 years. So as I say, I'll get you a copy of what is our employee handbook and the baseline components of what we have in our contracts in terms of those kind of exit processes if there are issues. but it all starts from day one in terms of how you structure those contracts and how you legislatively and legally give yourself the framework of exiting someone.
And the other point to note is all the startup to stand up members have access to business essentials, and there's an employment legal helpline there. Any issues around employment, you can check in with them. And the other thing I would say, Laura, on that, the businesses that I've had, we used to farm out HR. I think it was a company called Peninsula.
That's a very good one.
Yeah. And they're very good. And what they used to say is that if we followed their advice to the letter on any issue, they would cover the cost, any legal costs, and the defence in, defending a tribunal, employment tribunal. So that took a lot of stress away from us, Laura. So there's other companies that would do that, and they're reasonably inexpensive, worth looking at. Neil.
Yeah, thanks, Louisa. I was just thinking, you were talking about the different co-founders, and one bit I might have missed is, I guess, what the end success goals for the company are, or if you're on the same path to that, because I guess everyone's on a separate career journey. We had a discussion earlier in the week about, bringing people onto a team, and whether they're looking for the exit strategy, whether they're looking to build up, or whether their vision is to actually make the company the best company in the world and a market leader, and they want it to be their life story. How important do you feel that conversation is in bringing people on board?
I think it is important, again, if anybody has certainty. So I'm going to take this back to the marriage example, and a very specific personal example. I went on my first date with my girlfriend, and she said, "Do you want kids?" And I said, "Right now, I see no justification to, without consent, bring a human being into this terribly awful world." 2.5 years later, and I did say at the time, that's not me saying definitely no, but that's where my head's at now. 2.5 years later, I'm like, yes, with you, 100%. So as long as there isn't certainty, you can always have that ongoing and evolving conversation. And let's take it to a really basic level. If I said to you right now, go into your head, what do you want to do with your business? You would have an idea. And then I would say, if your sentiment about it changes, then you're in trouble. That's insane. Your sentiment about your business might change, and being open to the idea that your co-founder sentiment about your business might change is incredibly important. And this is where I say, if someone says to you, I definitely do not want to, sell the business, or I definitely do not want to build a floaty business, or I definitely do not want to go above 100 employees, that's something to think about. But if someone says, I'm not sure whether we should go for this or this, I don't think that's a problem. But again, it comes back to the really boring, repetitive nuts and bolts of the whole thing, which is you need to have the sort of relationship, like in a marriage, where you can talk about what you want, and you can have those conversations and create those compromises and align to an outcoming goal, or an outcome that suits both of you, or three of you, or four of you, or whatever it is. And I think that's the thing. I don't think the actual reality of what you want is the problem. I think it's about how you communicate it and how you then navigate your mutual kind of desires and interests for a business.
No, I think it is important. It's actually having the discussion, because it's probably interesting that so many founders wouldn't have that discussion. They get a little bit more into the matter of fact, rather than saying, well, what's the purpose of all of this?
Yeah. And as I say, it's the same in a relationship, I think it's that same evolution in the way that you talk to people. And the irony is that ability to communicate, whether you're talking about team members, founders, investors, etc., is going to be the thing that is actually the foundation of everything. Because when things go wrong, or things don't go to plan, or things change, or life throws a spanner into the works, and suddenly you have to walk away from the business for 9 months, or whatever it is, you need to be sure that the people you're talking to and the people you're surrounded by are able to manage that and exist. And actually, if you want an interesting read, go and read the story of the founder of Go Cardless, because actually he is a really good example of someone who built a team of co-founders and senior leadership and investors who, when he got hit by a car on his bicycle and was flattened and in the ICU, they just whoop and filled the gap and kept the company going for the 6-9 months that he was off grid, because they did have that constant communication and that aligned vision in terms of where the business was going. And it could have killed it, but it absolutely didn't.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil. And Louisa, do you think psychometric testing plays a part in all of this? And if so, what is there a particular brand you like or test you like?
I have a few that I've used in the past. I don't think it's the be all and end all, and I don't think it should be. I think it should be like a nice little indicator rather than like the core thing. I also think it's very easy to have an idea of what, for example, especially if you're hiring a team, having an idea of what works for you and then thinking you need to find things that fit that. And actually, again, I come back to my little trio of me and my two colleagues. The fact that one of my colleagues is so very different from me, but there's a huge amount of value in that, and a huge amount of kind of it's great to have that diversity of view and diversity of process. Not to say that she doesn't drive me up the wall occasionally and I drive her up the wall. So I think, yes, it's good for benchmarking how you operate with people and how they might fit into your team, but I wouldn't use it as a, well, they got this score, therefore good to go, you know?
Understood.
But again, what I can do is put together some recommendations of things that I've used in the past.
Please.
I might write a note of everything that I now promised to send over. So
send it to me and Lee. We can put it on Circle. And
yeah, amazing.
Well, that's been fantastic. Any final questions for Louisa? Peter.
Hi, Louisa. That was brilliant. Really good and really useful at this time of stage of development of my company, to be honest. Just remind me of a few things that came about in the past. My question is quite simple, actually. Your company name,
Auxeris.
Auxeris. Where does that come from?
So it means you will have grown in Latin, and the reason I picked it is because we eventually want to be selling into large-scale global corporates, and what I have discerned is that when large-scale global corporate leaders make decisions, they like trust-based relationships. So I didn't want to call it Hierify or something, because a lot of the competitors that we sit in the same space with are people like Knightsbridge Recruitment and Adecco and Allegis and Hayes and Michael Page, and they're all very trust-based brands. So I wanted something that sounded kind of old school and trustworthy, but actually meant something. So yeah, you will have grown.
Oh, thank you.
Wonderful.
Love that. Thanks, Louisa. Been a fantastic session. You're going to get a lot of love and respect and big ups today on LinkedIn and other digital platforms, as is our way.
Yeah.
And yeah, you're welcome to come back anytime. This is such a crucial area, and I think as well, with the way legislation changes, it's going to become even more critical for families. So yeah, we'll look forward to having you back soon.
Fantastic. And if anyone has any thoughts about hiring or needs to, I'm very frank. I will tell people when I think they're hiring the wrong position or they're hiring the wrong level.
I can confirm.
Yeah, I'm matter of fact. So and I'm always happy to talk to people about that. So
best way. Excellent.
Brilliant. Absolute pleasure to see everybody.
Thank you.
Do shout if you ever need anything. And yeah, have a lovely rest of your Friday.
Thanks, Louisa. Have a great weekend all.